Many thanks to the Data Diva Talks Privacy Podcast Privacy Champion, MineOS, for sponsoring this episode and for supporting our podcast. Data governance has become an even more difficult challenge with constantly evolving regulatory frameworks and AI systems set to introduce monumental complications. That's why I think organizations need MineOS. This platform helps organizations control and manage their enterprise data by providing a continuous single source of truth. Start today with a free personalized demo of MineOS, the industry's top no-code privacy and data ops solution. For more information about MineOS, visit their website at www.mineos.ai. Enjoy the show. Personal views and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy Podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information the businesses need to know now. I have a very special guest on the show. His name is Jay Averitt. He is the Senior Privacy Product Manager and Privacy Engineer at Microsoft. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Debbie. I really enjoyed listening to your podcast over the years, and it's great to actually be on here.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to have you on the show. This is a dream come true for me. I know the first time that you commented on something that I've written, I said, "Whoa, Jay's listened to my stuff. This is great."
Well, likewise. I enjoyed when you comment on my stuff as well, so it's great to actually be able to talk live with you.
Well, in addition to that, you call yourself a privacy evangelist, and I think that's a great moniker for you because I think that's what you do. So you definitely champion privacy. You're very supportive of people who are trying to put out good information. I always look at your profile because you're always saying, "Hey, look at this. Think about this." So I think that that's a great title for you. But before we get started, I would love to know your trajectory into privacy engineering. So you have a very unique path, I feel, where I know a lot of times I have a lot of people on who are lawyers. I have a lot of people who are in the technical part of privacy. I have data people like me, and then you're sort of in that middle space. But I would love for you to tell your trajectory, your path into more technical privacy.
Yeah, tech was always my first love. Growing up, infatuated with technology and knew that at an early age that was something that I really wanted to do with a career. But I also kind of like at the same time was always interested in law. I just got interested in reading. I read John Grisham books starting in middle school, and my dad wasn't an attorney, but had a lot of contact with attorneys, and I just always thought that would be something fun to do. But I started off my career in technology as a software engineer and really enjoyed that. But I started seeing in the early 2000s with the dot coms going bust. I was like, oh gosh, there might not be software engineers in the future, which, crystal ball, I was really wrong. And so I ended up going to law school and I was like, okay, well, there's got to be a way I can bridge my love of technology with a law degree and look for ways to do that, and started working as a software license attorney and had my hands on technology, but I was at home because it really just felt like I was working on contracts. And then I started with cloud stuff started coming up. Privacy really started to come into fray like in the early, I'd say 2010s. And I said, oh, okay, this is really interesting. And I got my hands on AWS and Azure and GCP and started looking at the cloud stuff. And I was like, this is really a fascinating new world. But then when GDPR came out, I was like, okay, this is really, I think, a perfect time. I was really not content just looking at contracts and working at it, looking at stuff from just a legal side. Maybe this is a time that I can use my law degree because obviously knowing the regs is important, but really go back to my roots in technology and find myself in a more operational privacy role. Start doing some consulting and then found my way, and I didn't know privacy engineering really existed until about 2 or 3 years ago. And I was like, oh, this is a perfect way of, you got to know the regs, got to know what's important from a GDPR, CCPA perspective, but you can really hone in on talking to engineers and working with engineers on a daily basis. So I really feel like I found my home in privacy engineering. I feel like everybody came to privacy from kind of a crooked path, and it's fun working with folks from all different backgrounds in this path.
I love that. I love that. You're doing a job that didn't exist many years ago. So I think people who are like you that maybe have different skills they can bring to this area are really interested in this path because I think it's a really fascinating path. I want to talk to you a little bit about privacy by design. We talk about that a lot, right? Hey, you need to design privacy. Part of that privacy by design really is thinking about privacy at a fundamental foundational level, not thinking of it as something you could tack on at the end. Tell me your thoughts about how companies think about privacy by design. I'll give you my thoughts.
Sure.
A lot of times I feel like the way that organizations think about privacy, it is at the end, right? If you think about it from a legal perspective, a lot of times people think about legal because legal is very reactive, right? Where we're saying, hey, think about it before it becomes like a legal issue. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's completely right. I mean, I think there's a ton of companies out there that absolutely do consider privacy, but not until they look at it for the final sign off and say, oh, have we considered privacy? Because they do want to make sure that there's no GDPR sting or CCPA sting that's coming to bite them at the end. But the problem with that is that if you're looking at it at the end, I mean, there's only so much you can do. You might be able to finesse something. We're going to use best efforts to make sure that we're going to comply with the privacy regulations. But you've not considered privacy throughout the process of your design. So there's probably things that may aggravate your users that are not privacy centric, or you may just miss something that is a GDPR problem because you're doing it at the 11th hour. And last but not least, probably costing your company more money, because if you're looking at the end of the release cycle and you're having to bake privacy in at that 11th hour, it's probably going to be expensive because one, you're delaying a release that everyone's been excited about, put a bunch of time into. It's just more difficult to rework privacy in at the end than privacy has been considered all the way throughout the process. The better way to do it as a privacy engineer, as somebody that's a privacy professional, they should really advocate for privacy by design principles to be in as early as possible in the software development. Or you've actually started coding something, privacy should be consulted and say, hey, we're planning on building this widget. Do you see some issues with it from a privacy standpoint? And that way, that privacy can be built into the widget from the beginning. And then at the end, when you're looking for final sign off, then there should be no problem. You're going to need legal to sign off on it, even if you have baked privacy in. But if you've got a good privacy engineer and the engineers have listened throughout the process, then it isn't going to be a problem. You don't have that big ticket expenditure at the end of the process, and your releases aren't delayed because it's been. So, yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. If you can, as a company, really consider privacy early on in the process, you're just going to be much better off.
I agree with that 100%. Let's talk a little bit about privacy laws, especially things like in the US, right? So what we're seeing is almost a repeat of what happened with data breach notification laws in the US, where California started out strong, other states liked what California was doing, decided they want to do their own thing, right? So every state has their own special sauce, right? And now we have a patchwork of laws for every state with data breach. And I think that's what's happening with privacy regulations, where they're going that same path. But as an organization, you can't really lurch from one law to the next and get super excited just because, hey, New Jersey just passed something new. You can't upset the apple cart every time a new state creates a new law. Tell me about, especially from a privacy engineering point of view, how do you think about when a new law comes out?
Yeah.
I'm hoping that you're thinking about it more from a foundational point of view. But tell me your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny the word you use, patchwork, because I was just about to say, I mean, it's basically a patchwork quilt of privacy regulations we have here in the US. And even if I wanted to, I couldn't be an expert on every single state's privacy laws because that would take up all of my time and I wouldn't be able to do anything else. And that's not what I want to do, or I'd be a privacy lawyer, not a privacy engineer. And so I think the best approach is if you're complying with GDPR, you probably are going to be pretty good for most of the US laws. I mean, the CCPA pretty much models the GDPR. If you can comply with the edicts that are in there, especially around like timeframes for DSARs and things of that nature, I mean, you're probably going to be okay under there. You're obviously going to want to consult with your attorneys to make sure that there's no random stuff popping up all the time. Like Quebec had a law come up, and there were some things that I had to look at from the upsell standpoint that I hadn't considered. So there's always going to be something that you might have to look at that's different. But I think just from a design and good privacy program stance, if you build your privacy program and say, hey, we're going to comply with all aspects of the GDPR, then more than likely, whatever state law comes down the pike or other international law comes down, you're going to be okay. There's going to be some nuance that you're going to have to comply with, and you're going to hopefully have good privacy counsel to help you understand what that nuance is and make sure that you're designing your program that complies with that. But there's nothing crazy that comes down. There's like, we've got to completely redesign it because some renegade state throwing something out there and you're having to figure out what to do. And I don't know. Hopefully one day we'll have a federal law, but as the years go by, I wonder when that might happen.
I think we all wonder when or if that may ever happen. I have a question about AI. So we're in a really interesting space now with AI where there really isn't quote unquote regulations except for what we see happening in, the EU. Actually, China has a generative AI law, but how can we explain how AI impacts privacy?
Yeah, it is an interesting time to be in this space, and it's something that AI has been around for a while, and machine learning has been around for even longer than that. But it's not something that was being injected into every single product. And it seems like even products that you wouldn't think needed an AI component is a popular buzzword to throw into everything. The way I look at it is a lot of the privacy fundamentals that we look at, like especially like data minimization. So do we need to store like if we're looking like at an LLM, for example, chat GPT like product, do we need to store the prompt of the customer data that's being provided to us as part of this, which could be relatively massive and include some pretty confidential stuff? Is there a reason we need to store that stuff? And how can we minimize what we're storing of the customer's data? I mean, I think that's a big part of it. Also, the models themselves, how are we building those models with the data that's being collected? And is there a way, since we need to make these models better, if we're not actually storing customer data, is there a way of maybe anonymizing that data to a standpoint that we feel comfortable that we can build a model on top of that? We've got to look at things like, from a responsible AI standpoint, is the model bias? And are we treating some classes not fairly? And so is there a mechanism in place for an individual to say, hey, I'm seeing bias? And then if there is that mechanism in place to say, hey, I see some bias in the model, maybe you should take a look at it. How are we storing that information and what are we doing with it? So I think there's a lot of interesting privacy problems that arise from AI. I think a lot of what we've learned from privacy certainly helps. A fundamental thing of privacy is transparency, and that should be the same in AI, but also data minimization is a fundamental. But so the transparency of and fairness is another thing. So if you want to be transparent and fair, that means not having some bias in your LLM. How do you square that with data minimization, where you need the data to understand that the model was biased, but you also don't want to collect more from your customer than you need to. So, I mean, these are just things that I'm thinking about a lot. I think that a lot of people are thinking about a lot, and I don't think there's clear answers on how to solve these problems, but I think they're interesting problems to solve. And I think the frameworks that we've used in the past got to be our guideposts, and then we'll see where we go from there.
I think two things to make privacy challenging, I think, when I think about it from a technical perspective, and that is a lot of applications were not created to forget stuff.
Right.
They were created to remember things, right? So if you forgot stuff, that was bad, right? So forgetting and deleting or minimizing things wasn't really the thought process around developing tools. And then transparency, where a lot of these tools are never built to be transparent either, right? So it's like, okay, the person's working on it. There is like Santa's workshop, they put stuff in it and something comes out at the end, right?
Yeah, those are two very good points. I mean, I think we can learn from mistakes that were made early on and the big data boom of just collecting everything for collection's sake. Because as you said, why would we delete it? Because one day we may need this for some kind of analytics or something. And the more data we can collect, the more powerful we are. And that was it for a long time until GDPR and CCPA came out and companies actually started thinking, oh crap, we actually have to consider privacy and we can't just absorb, vacuum up every single piece of data. We need to learn from when we're looking at LLMs, because obviously there's a huge amount of data that you could be collecting, could be very valuable, because the more prompts we have, the better the models could be. We know, particularly if you're getting feedback on that, we've got to learn from what we did in the past and not go back there. And yeah, the transparency part of it, almost all privacy policies, unless somebody's really skilled, are almost impossible to read, even as a lawyer. Even I like only look at them half the time because I can't change it. And so, what's the point of me like reviewing this except for like looking at, oh, big gotchas in it? I think we've got to learn from that also and make it as clear as possible, especially, I mean, LLMs give the opportunity for people to disclose a lot of stuff that would be extremely confidential and potentially stuff dealing with their intellectual property. So we've got to be really transparent about what's being collected.
So, Jay, what is happening in the world right now around privacy or data that concerns you? Something that's more top of mind for you.
I'm concerned about dark patterns. Every app you download wants to do things that just don't even make sense. Like Chick-fil-A is one of my favorite restaurants. I love their app. It's a great app. But when I downloaded it, it said, hey, we want to scan your network to see if there's other devices on it. I'm like, why do you need to scan my network to see if there's other devices on it? I just want to use my phone to order my food. That should have nothing to do with any other device on my network. It's not a bad app. I think it's fine. But I think that just shows you what all apps are doing is collecting information they want. Luckily, Google and Apple have made it more transparent. So when an app is doing these things, you at least know what they're attempting to do sometimes. And you get those warnings. But it's crazy the amount of stuff that's out there, especially around health related apps, I think are the most concerning. Read a bunch about period tracking apps and the information that are being collected about women's menstrual periods, and they're collecting all kinds of information that they don't need. And I don't understand how they can get around HIPAA because of certain loopholes and such, but it's really concerning what's being done. So, I mean, I think privacy is ignored a lot of places, and and users unfortunately are just not educated enough or just don't care about what's being done in the consumer space. So, I mean, I think a lot of times big tech gets slammed for not considering privacy. But I mean, I can tell you, we're actually looking at it, but a lot of places it's just being ignored. And I went and bought a car not too long ago, and went to go fill out an application for a loan. And when I start typing in my information, start pre-filling with 25 other different people's names and social security numbers on there. And I asked the guy, I was like, hey, have you thought about maybe opening this up in incognito mode or something where it's not storing it? Or for God's sake, please just turn off the autocomplete. And he's like, oh, you're the first person that said anything about it. And I think that's a lot of it is consumers need to be better educated about the privacy pitfalls that are out there. And then, yes, there's some companies out there that really are doing nefarious things. And I wish that they weren't. And I wish privacy was better considered there.
I agree with that. And, I run across that a lot. I know, just like you were saying about the Chick-fil-A app, right? And I'm glad that there are more prompts, I believe, especially if you're using the app on your phone where they're like, hey, do you want to share your address book or do you want to share all of your, anything that's on Google Drive or OneDrive to this company? You're like, no, I don't want to do that. So at least giving you that idea that you have to make a decision to share more data if you want to do, like you say, get your chicken nuggets. I think that's the positive part. I think the thing that concerns me the most, and I think you touched on it, and is around putting so much work on the consumer, right? Where it's like, I don't have time to read 80-page privacy policies for every tool, or I don't have time to go into every website and change all these different privacy settings. And a lot of those settings, they reset after a period of time. So like you can go through and do this really diligent reset of certain things, and they may say, hey, in a year, we're going to like put the stuff back the way that it was, and you have to go back and fight your way through it again. What are your thoughts?
I think you're right. I mean, I think that it's another throwback to what we were talking about before, that privacy should be baked in to everyone's place. I mean, throwing just a privacy policy up with a laundry list of things you're collecting and making it impossible to read. Yeah, no consumer is going to look at that. And we can't educate a consumer to the point that they're going to be an expert at reading that, or otherwise we have way more lawyers out there than we need. Yeah, I mean, I think making the prompts are helpful, but also just making it as clear and easy as possible if you're out there. I mean, why do we need like 50-page privacy policies? How about just, I've seen things that look like medicine labels that show privacy. I think those are a good step. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't even need to be that complicated. Say, how about like 4 or 5 bullet points? This is what we're going to do. And I mean, and if it's more than 4 or 5 bullet points of what you're doing, maybe you should reconsider what you're doing from a data minimization piece, because why do you need all of this information to order Chick-fil-A or to track your period? In the spirit of transparency, we've got to get away from convoluted messages to the consumer and make them more digestible.
When I talk to tech people who aren't privacy egghead people like us, I tell them the two major privacy problems are data collection and data retention, right? So when we're talking about collection, you're absolutely right around fundamentals, not collecting too much, figuring out why you're collecting things is really important. But then a lot of people get in trouble or they lose the plot on the retention side. So, and this is another thing where I feel like organizations have traditionally never had to have a reason to delete stuff so they can keep stuff forever, right?
Right.
And what these laws are saying is like, you shouldn't keep certain things forever. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I'll tell you, that's the thing that I am talking to engineers the most on is, okay, see what you're doing here. Good stuff from the minimization standpoint, but what is our mechanism to delete data if there is a request for that? I think that's something that they forget about. I don't know why, just because their mindset is, hey, give her up data, and it's not, oh, how can we delete it? Because I mean, a lot of times if somebody serves you with a data subject access request, you've got to be able to figure out a way to delete it. So I mean, there's two pieces of that. The retention piece that you spoke of is an important part. I mean, maybe you should not be collecting things for more than 30 days that you don't absolutely need to. Maybe you should be having something in there to delete it at the 30-day mark. So in that case, then a lot of that, you can save yourself a lot of headaches if you're not retaining stuff for longer than 30 days. That includes a lot of personal data, or you're using some kind of GDPR approved anonymization technique to if you need to keep it longer than that 30-day period. But you also got to think about if somebody wants to delete this data, how can we do it? And it's got to be easy. I mean, you can't say, okay, especially like in my space where a lot of times where it's not going to an end consumer, it's going to a business. The business needs to have the right to figure out how to delete. If an individual makes a request to that business, they need to have to be able to figure out how to delete that because we haven't made it as easy as possible for the business. Then we haven't done a good job. Engineers will be like, well, they can do it if they go to root. And I'm like, no, you can't. You've got to make it as easy as possible. You got to make it your common IT administrator, not some Linux hacker, can actually delete this information. So, I mean, I think those are the two main spaces. One, really look at your retention periods and really figure out, okay, how sensitive is this data? How long are we going to retain it based on the sensitivity? And then two, if we are retaining the sensitive data for some reason, what mechanisms are out there to delete that data if somebody asks for that? Even if the person doesn't ask, what if that person leaves the company? You need to be able to delete that data if that person leaves the company. You shouldn't be retaining all that information. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. I'm very much a fan, and I've heard you talk about this about making sure organizations have playbooks for what they would do if these situations arise, as opposed to acting surprised when someone wants something deleted.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, it's going to happen. In businesses you wouldn't think it would happen as much as it does. Like I've seen it. Hotels get data subject access requests. So even not just your standard tech companies, you're going to get these data subject access requests all over the place. And that's just the landscape we're in. Your solution to that should not be, hey, if you want your stuff deleted, email privacy at thedatadiva.com because it's going to be a hard time for somebody to be having a manual process of monitoring that privacy and then making sure you're complying with whatever regulation you need to be complying with a manual process. So you better be having a streamlined process for that because you'll fail more than likely if you're trying to do it manually.
Yeah, I agree. So if it were the world, according to Jay, and we did everything you said, what would be your wish for privacy anywhere in the world, whether that be regulation, technology, human behavior? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, great question. What I would wish is every company would really look at two things. One is what are we doing from a privacy standpoint, fundamentally fair to the user? And two, if I am the user, how would I think about what we're doing from a privacy standpoint? Because I mean, I think that's what gets lost. And a lot of the development of stuff is okay, yeah, this is great from a business perspective, but how are we treating individuals and treating our end user at the end of the day? Because I mean, ultimately, if you think about those two things, you may think, okay, well, this may be expensive from a business standpoint because we're having to put a lot of privacy controls or do things that we wouldn't ordinarily do without thinking about those two things. But what you are doing is you're building trust with your user base. And if your user thinks, okay, well, they actually care about me and this company is really got top-notch privacy and they're a company I want to do business with. So if you build that trust, I think at the end of the day, you're going to find more business is going to flow your way. That's the way I look at privacy from my world, and maybe other people have different ideas, but I think if everybody looked at it from at least those two things, at least we'd be in a better spot privacy-wise than we are today.
I agree with that. You hit the nail on the head with that because I feel like if you can't articulate how what you're doing with someone's data benefits them, then you're already off the rails, I feel.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Yeah, because all the information you have to provide to order a pizza, if you're thinking about it from a user perspective, why do I need to fill out all this? I'd rented an electric car, which is not a good idea to rent an electric car. They're fun, I might buy one. But renting one, there's a hassle because you got to find a charger. And when you're on a vacation or a trip, that's the last thing you want to be doing. And so I was at this random charger in Birmingham, Alabama, when I was visiting my parents and trying to charge the car. And it said, okay, you've got to sign up for this app to charge the car. And I said, okay. I mean, it didn't ask for like what year the car was. Well, I don't even know. I mean, this is a rental car. It's like asking all this information. I'm like, why do you need this? All you need is my credit card to charge my car. I have no idea why they needed all the information it was collecting. I'm sure it was for some kind of data broker or some kind of analytics they were running. But I was so frustrated filling out this information. If I had any choice in the matter, I would have gone somewhere else. That is what happens when you aren't thinking about the user. Is you have the risk of really ticking off your customers, and they may find someone else that actually values privacy.
Yeah. And so next time you rent a electric car, or maybe you won't rent one, you'll steer clear of that company.
Exactly.
Well, it's been great to have you on the show. I'm really thrilled to be able to chat with you. I know that people will find your insights really valuable, and definitely follow Jay on LinkedIn. You always put out some great information. It's very educational.
Thanks so much for having me, Debbie. It's been a delight. And follow Debbie as well. I've learned so much from her, so I'm glad to actually have a talk with her. But thanks so much.
Oh, that's so sweet. Oh, thank you so much. Well, we'll talk soon, and I look forward to being able to collaborate with you in the future.
All right. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.